In this episode, we move from selecting and documenting controls to keeping them real over time, because a control set that only exists at assessment time is not truly a compliance program. Continued compliance is the ability to demonstrate, month after month, that controls are still implemented, still operating as intended, and still appropriate for the system as it evolves. The two engines that make that possible are continuous monitoring and vulnerability management, and they work best when they are designed together rather than treated as separate chores. Continuous monitoring gives you ongoing visibility into whether controls and system conditions are staying within expectations. Vulnerability management gives you a disciplined way to find weaknesses, prioritize them, and reduce exposure before they turn into incidents. The goal here is to help you design a continued compliance strategy that is realistic for how organizations work, that stays aligned with your framework intent, and that produces evidence that an assessor can trust without turning your team into full-time report writers. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good continued compliance strategy begins with a shift in mindset from point in time to always on, but not in the sense that everything is watched constantly with equal intensity. It means you accept that systems drift, people change, and threats evolve, so compliance must be maintained through repeated verification rather than assumed permanence. A baseline control might be implemented correctly today and quietly degrade next quarter because a configuration was changed, an integration was added, or access approvals became informal under schedule pressure. The purpose of continuous monitoring is to detect that kind of drift and make it visible early, when correction is easy. The purpose of vulnerability management is to address weaknesses that emerge from software flaws, misconfigurations, and dependency changes, which are normal in modern systems. If you design continued compliance as a set of periodic, intentional checks tied to key risks and key controls, it becomes manageable and it becomes credible. If you design it as a vague promise to monitor continuously, it becomes either meaningless or overwhelming. To design continuous monitoring in a defensible way, start by deciding what you actually need to know to be confident that your control objectives are still being met. Think back to confidentiality, integrity, and availability outcomes, and ask what signals would tell you those outcomes are being threatened. For confidentiality, signals might include unusual access patterns, privilege escalations, unexpected data exports, or changes to access rules. For integrity, signals might include unauthorized changes, unexpected configuration drift, failed validation checks, or anomalies in critical records. For availability, signals might include service outages, capacity thresholds, denial of service symptoms, or repeated failures in dependent services. Continuous monitoring is not just about collecting data. It is about selecting meaningful signals that map to your control set. When your monitoring signals align with control intent, the evidence you produce is naturally relevant to compliance, not just interesting to engineers. A key beginner misunderstanding is thinking continuous monitoring means you are watching everything in real time, all the time, with a person staring at a dashboard. In reality, most effective continuous monitoring is a combination of automated collection, defined alert conditions, periodic review, and escalation procedures when thresholds are met. The idea is to build a feedback loop where the system generates evidence of its own condition and where people respond when that evidence shows risk. Some controls are best monitored with event-based alerts, like an administrator adding a new privileged account, while others are best monitored with scheduled checks, like a weekly review of critical configuration settings. Some are best monitored with periodic audits, like quarterly access recertifications, which are still part of continuous monitoring because they are recurring. The word continuous is about ongoing cadence, not nonstop human attention. A defensible strategy chooses the right monitoring method for each control and justifies it in terms of risk and feasibility. Another foundational part of continued compliance is deciding what is in scope for monitoring, because monitoring can easily become fragmented across environments and shared services. If production is monitored well but development and testing are not, and those environments handle sensitive information types or share credentials, the compliance story becomes weaker. If shared services provide monitoring capabilities, your strategy should show how your system is included, what events are collected, and what responsibilities remain with your team. This is where inherited controls matter again, because centralized logging, identity monitoring, and network monitoring might be common controls, but your system's compliance depends on them actually covering your components and being reviewed appropriately. Your design should state how monitoring is coordinated across owners, such as who receives alerts, who investigates, and who documents outcomes. Without that coordination, you can have excellent monitoring data and still fail compliance because no one can prove that alerts were handled. Continued compliance is not just visibility. It is visibility plus action plus records. Vulnerability management is the second engine, and it deserves careful definition because beginners sometimes think it is just scanning. Vulnerability management is a life cycle of discovering weaknesses, assessing risk, prioritizing remediation, applying fixes or mitigations, and verifying that the exposure is reduced. Vulnerabilities can come from software flaws, outdated dependencies, misconfigurations, weak access settings, and even operational practices that create openings. In a compliance context, vulnerability management is important because many frameworks expect that known issues are handled within defined timeframes and that risk decisions are documented when remediation is not immediate. The strategy must be repeatable, which means it should not depend on one person remembering to run a scan or one person noticing a security bulletin. It should define what sources of vulnerability information are used, how often the system is evaluated, how severity is interpreted, and how remediation is tracked. When those elements exist, your vulnerability program becomes evidence of diligence rather than a sporadic technical task. The most important design choice in vulnerability management is prioritization logic, because not all vulnerabilities are equal. A serious vulnerability on an internet-exposed component is usually more urgent than the same vulnerability on a tightly isolated component. And a vulnerability in a critical system can be more urgent than a vulnerability in a low-impact system. Prioritization should consider severity, exposure, exploitability, and the criticality of the affected component, and it should align with your system impact level and security objectives. This is where people often get trapped by purely numeric scoring, because a score can be helpful, but it does not capture context by itself. A defensible strategy uses scoring as an input and then applies contextual judgment in a consistent way, documenting why certain items were treated as urgent and others were scheduled. The documentation is what makes your prioritization credible, because it shows you made a reasoned decision rather than ignoring inconvenient work. In compliance, the ability to explain prioritization calmly is often more important than claiming every issue is fixed immediately. Continuous monitoring and vulnerability management reinforce each other when designed correctly, and that connection is what makes the strategy strong. Monitoring can detect signs that a vulnerability is being exploited or that a configuration change introduced exposure, which helps you prioritize response. Vulnerability management can drive monitoring focus, such as adding alerts around components with known weaknesses until remediation is complete. Monitoring can also verify that remediation did not break controls, because fixes sometimes introduce new issues, like disabling logging or changing access behavior. When you design them together, you avoid the pattern where vulnerability work happens in one corner and monitoring happens in another corner, with no shared picture of risk. The outcome you want is a living understanding of system security posture that supports compliance continuously, not just at audit time. That is what makes continued compliance feel like steady stewardship rather than periodic panic. A continued compliance strategy also needs a cadence, because without cadence, everything becomes vague and easy to postpone. Cadence means you define recurring reviews for different control areas, such as access reviews, log reviews, configuration baseline checks, backup verification, and incident response exercises where applicable. You also define recurring vulnerability activities, such as scanning or assessment, patch and remediation cycles, and verification checks. The cadence does not have to be the same for everything, and it should not be, because different controls have different risk profiles and operational costs. High-impact controls tied to high-consequence objectives might be checked more frequently, while lower risk areas might be checked less often but still consistently. The important part is that cadence is defined and documented, because that is what makes it testable. When an assessor asks how you maintain compliance, you can point to recurring activities that produce evidence, rather than promising that the team is generally vigilant. Evidence production is the part that separates a good strategy from a fragile one, because compliance requires proof, not good intentions. Your strategy should identify what evidence will be retained for monitoring and vulnerability activities, such as review records, alert triage notes, remediation tickets, exception approvals, and verification results. The evidence does not need to be excessive, but it needs to be consistent and trustworthy, and it should be protected from tampering where appropriate. A simple, defensible approach is to ensure that for each recurring activity, there is a record of completion, a record of findings, and a record of actions taken. If no issues were found, that is still a finding and should be recorded in a lightweight way. If issues were found, the record should show who was assigned, what the plan was, and when it was resolved or accepted as risk. This is how you create an audit trail that matches real operations rather than retroactively inventing one. A continued compliance strategy that does not define evidence tends to fail when staff turnover occurs or when an assessment happens months later. Another important design element is governance around exceptions, because vulnerability management and monitoring will inevitably surface situations where immediate remediation is not possible. Maybe a fix is not available, or applying it would disrupt operations, or the component is managed by a third party, or the change window is constrained. A continued compliance strategy should include a disciplined way to document exceptions, define compensating measures, set review dates, and ensure exceptions do not become permanent forgetfulness. This is where you connect back to risk management, because exceptions are risk decisions. If a vulnerability remains open, your strategy should show what is being done to reduce exposure, such as additional monitoring, tightened access, or temporary restrictions, and it should show that leadership understands and accepts the risk. This keeps vulnerability management credible and prevents the common pattern of unresolved issues being quietly ignored. In a compliance setting, an honest, well-managed exception process often looks better than a claim that everything is always perfect. By the end of this lesson, the main skill is designing continued compliance as a living system of visibility, action, and evidence. Continuous monitoring gives you recurring signals that controls are operating and that system conditions remain within expectations, and it does so through a mix of alerts, scheduled checks, and periodic reviews that match risk. Vulnerability management gives you a disciplined way to identify weaknesses, prioritize them based on severity and context, remediate or mitigate them, and verify results, all with clear records. When you design these together, you create a feedback loop that keeps the control set effective and keeps compliance defensible without requiring heroic effort during audits. The goal is not to monitor everything, but to monitor the right things consistently and to treat vulnerabilities as an ongoing operational reality that is managed transparently. When you do this well, assessments become confirmations of a steady process rather than stressful events that force you to scramble for proof.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.